Hi, my name is Dan Clark, and welcome to another session of BruisedCoding. Today we'll be looking at the receive chain method in rspec, and we'll be looking at a equivalent in minitest that can do somewhat the same thing. The idea here is we want to have something to basically handle something that's a chain of messages or method calls and be able to stub that out so that we can do a proper unit test. So right here, this is going to be my contrived example. There's really nothing too special about this. We have about, let's see, 3 classes, actually 4. One's an exception. That's at the top. We have our grumpy game fairy, which is going to be kind of some comic relief here, but basically the idea there is whenever we raise that, it's just something has gone wrong, basically. At the bottom, we have our game class, and this only contains a single instance method, which basically checks to see if we're done or not. This is not really a game, it's just, are we done? And the way it does that, it's calling a game fairy gateway. So the idea here is we have a game, and in order to find out if the game is done or not, we need to consult the mystical game fairy. However, we are not worthy of speaking to the game fairy directly, so we need this game fairy gateway to relay our messages to the game fairy. Well, really to get a game fairy and then to let us check their proclamation. So essentially what we have here is in-game, in our done method, we're creating a new game fairy gateway and we're calling the get fairy method on it. So that's on line 26. And all that's doing is it's just setting up a new game fairy. It's instantiating a new game fairy instance and then passing it back. And from there, we are calling the proclamation method on game fairy. Now this is that chain method, chain message type thing that I was referring to. So we have the game fairy gateway, we call the get fairy message on it, or method on it, and then we call proclamation on that fairy that comes back. And what the proclamation does is it essentially calls a private method called Mystic Visions, which normally we should either say, well, this again is a contrived example, the game is in stalemate, so we're not done yet, false, or the game is won, and that is true. If we don't get one of those messages, we're going to raise a grumpy game fairy. And in this contrived example, the Mystic Visions is kind of broken. It's the fairy doesn't really want to talk to us, so it's kind of getting us to leave me alone message. But either way, we want to test this out. We want to see if we can get this all working. So to that point, what I want to show you now is how we can test this out. Like I said, if we were to try this out, it would be broken. We'd be getting grumpy game fire if we tried to run instances of done, if we instantiated a game. So the idea here is we want to stub out some stuff. We want to specifically stub out this game fairy gateway message chain so that we can properly test done. So like set up an instance where the game fairy will do something that returns a false and then do something where it returns a true. So let me go to our examples. Actually, you know what? I'm going to open up a new one. So tab new, and let's look at the rspec one first, because that is where we can kind of get some fun stuff going on, and where I can show the example of the received message chain. So this is typical rspec. Uses a DSL. If you're not familiar with rspec, it's one of the major testing frameworks available. Some people love it, some people absolutely hate it. It's kind of like Vim versus Emacs. Well, Vim versus everything else pretty much, but I'm a rspec fan, so save the hate mail. I'm not going to read it. But essentially what we're doing here is we have a subject. I'm setting up an explicit subject so to make it a little bit easier to read. And we're testing that done method here, and we have 2 contexts. We want to see when the game fairy says there's a tie, and when the game fairy says that there is, actually I need to fix that, but that shouldn't say player 1 is the winner. It should just say that the game is over with. So ignore that a little bit. But what these two tests are doing more or less the same thing, but what they're different in is both of them are mocking out the get fairy proclamation message chain, and they're using the receive message chain here. So we're allowing the game fairy gateway to receive that message chain with those particular messages, so get fairy and proclamation, and depending on the test, we're either going to return true, or we're going to return false. So if I were to go and run this, let's do that. Actually, let me just clear this out, and we're going to run rspec. Oh, hello, game spec. And there we go, it passes. So if I were to try and break this, so like let's say we don't have these stubbed out. Now I run it. We get the grumpy game fairy. Outlook is cloudy. Please try again later for both tests. So this is kind of like what I mean. Right now the actual code is broken. We can't use it. However, we can stub out the game fairy, so even though she's grumpy or he's grumpy, we can stub that out and make it return whatever we want it to using that receive message chain. And that's pretty much it. This is, to me, this is kind of old hat. One thing to note though, rspec, if you were to look up this in the documentation, this received message chain, it will tell you that this is something that is kind of a code smell, and if you're using this, you're probably breaking or bending Demeter's law here, so you probably might want to consider refactoring stuff to make your code a little bit more, let's say, better, or at least less complex, make the objects a little bit more separated so that there's not a strong coupling between them. But anyway, that's not really the point here. The point here is, let's say we have some legacy code and we just want to throw some tests. We're going to use that receive message chain to make our lives a lot easier. All right. So now that being said, let's close out of that. And now let's open up the minitest test. So let me get into that. So now this is what the minitest version looks like. It's a little bit different. The key thing here is it's not using the DSL. This is Ruby code, more or less. You actually run this using Ruby, not rspec. So anyone who's familiar with object-oriented programming, this should be more or less the same. This shouldn't be too hard to see. We have a setup method which essentially sets up our subject. So in this case we have a game, but I'm doing something a little bit different here because minitest does not have that receive message chain. Instead what it has is what you need to do is basically set up a dummy variable for something. Well, actually here, first before I get into that, we have two ways of doing stubs. We do it this way, where we take the object that we want to kind of stub out, take the method that we're looking to stub, and return whatever it's supposed to return. So in this case, we have false and true. And then you have another way, which is basically you kind of set up a block. So in this case, like we said, we wanted to stub out that game fairy gateway. So you take the object, you stub it out, and you stub out the method. So in this case, we're stubbing out that get fairy method. But now this is where things get a little bit different from the rspec side. In this case, this will return something. And in this case, we're returning this dummy object called game fairy, which we set up at the top here. So this is a dummy. And the other method, the other stub, is this game fairy proclamation. So this is that other stub. So essentially what we're doing is we have two stubs. We have a stub on get fairy and the game fairy gateway object, which is then returning the stubbed dummy game fairy with its proclamation. So we've kind of had to go a little bit more roundabout to create this chained message stub, but it does the same thing. It's still going to test it out. In this case, it's still going to work. So for example, if I run this now, so like I said, I just need to do Ruby, minitest, and test game, and voila, it works. And now if I, for example, if I take out, I'll just do one of the blocks. So essentially now what I'm doing is I'm just testing out game.done without any type of stubbing. Even though I have this up here stubbed out, it's not going to use it because it's not actually being used anywhere. So if I do it now, let me save that out. Let's run that again. Now we get that grumpy game fairy exception. Outlook is cloudy. Try again for the test that I took out the stubbing. So this is essentially how you would do that rspec rspec receive message chain stubbing. That's pretty much it. Again, I just want to stress here, though, if you're doing this type of stubbing, I mean, here it's really a contrived example and it's really simplistic, but most likely the types of situations that you're going to be doing this, it's going to be a little bit worse, probably a little bit more complex. So you're probably going to want to refactor if you're resorting to these types of methods. Just want to throw that out there, and just hopefully this is kind of a reality check for anyone who's trying to use these types of tools. But again, if you need to do it because, let's say, you inherited some code base and you have no idea what these mystical objects are, right? So we have our game fairy that does something that we don't understand and we just can't because our human brains aren't whatever. We can resort to using some sort of chained message stubbing, whether it be an rspec or minitest. And also, part of my reason for even doing this is because in the team that I am a part of, we have most of our tests are in rspec. So chained or receive chained messages is not a foreign thing to us. However, in minitest, we have a app that does use. We have one app that uses minitest, and unfortunately, we don't have that chained message stub. So, unfortunately, we had to come up with something else when we were creating tests where we wanted to use the receive message chain method. So that's kind of the context where I came from with this, and hopefully I've saved someone a little bit of time and headache trying to figure out how to do this. Again, please don't use this on new code. If you can, do it the right way, which is make sure your objects are a little bit more decoupled. But for those of you that need it, it's there, it's available. This is how I was able to get around my issues, so hopefully it helps you if you need to get to that point. If you have any questions, you can hit me up on Twitter. My handle is @DanClark. I have a blog at bruisedthumb.com, which has an accompanying blog post to this, so if you just want to see the code. I also have this code up on my GitHub repo, so you can also pull it down and play with it yourself. Go to my website and check out the blog post there. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter and ask away. And thank you for hearing me out. Have a great day.